So if you're Malaysian, you probably know about it, right? It's the thing that enables you to be watching this thing right now, enables you to cook your Maggi mee and, play video games and all that. They also have foreign operations in the UK, Kuwait, Turkey, Pakistan, India, Saudi Arabia. So now, how about the profit before tax? 2016, that number was 8.9 billion, and 2020, it has fell to 4.1 billion. If you bought it in April 2018, you would be down 39%. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, best place for long-term stock investors. My name is MJ, and today we're going to cover and talk about Tenaga. Now, what are we going to cover? Obviously, we're going to cover basically what they do, a bit of their history. We'll take a look at their management. Then, of course, we can never ignore their financials. And if you stay until the end, you'll know what are some of the potential and some of the risk of investing in Tenaga. Now, before I begin explaining to you a little bit about Tenaga, I want to share with you why is it that we are covering it. Basically, since November 2013, Tenaga's share price is flat. And since April 2018, if you bought it in April 2018, you would be down 39%, right? So some people are saying, hey, Tenaga is like a well-known blue chip company and it's down 40%. How can this be? How can a blue chip be down 40%? So maybe some people think that they are afraid. Maybe you're a shareholder, you're afraid that it's going to go down further. Or maybe it's a good opportunity to buy. Let's find out. Before we begin, right, make sure you get your free guidebook. Link is in the description or the comments. Basically, this book is going to help you bring you from 0 to 6 figures in, ASAP. So let's take a look at what Tenaga actually does. So if you're Malaysian, you probably know about it, right? It's the thing that enables you to be watching this thing right now, enables you to cook your Maggi mee and, play video games and all that. Basically, it's an electric utility company. So now a little bit of history. Tenaga actually was not called Tenaga in the past, right? In 1949, it used to be called the Central Electricity Board, right? Ancient times, right? And back then, they only had 2,500 employees. They generated only about 40 megawatts worth of energy, and it only served 45.5 thousand people back then in Malaysia. Then in 1965, it got renamed to the National Electricity Board. During the 80s, it started to build the national grid, which connected Malaysia electricity-wise with Singapore and Thailand. Now, 1988, the Malaysian government decided to privatize, this company. And so in 1990, they finally managed to change the name to Tenaga Nasional Berhad, or TNB. And then, of course, in 1992, Tenaga was listed on the Malaysian stock market. As of 2019, they have 47 power plants in Peninsular Malaysia. Most of their business is in Peninsular Malaysia, even though they do have subsidiaries in places like Sarawak. Now, instead of 40 megawatt, now they do 10,600 megawatts a year in terms of electricity generated. And they serve 9.5 million people. They've come a very long way, obviously. They also have foreign operations in the UK, Kuwait, Turkey, Pakistan, India, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. A lot of it, or at least half of it, has to do with renewable energies. Let's now take a look at Tenaga's business model. Basically, how do they make money and how do they get the electricity to you? So basically, there are 4 key sections when it comes to Tenaga's business. Number 1 is generation, right? How do they generate electricity? The second is the grid. Number 3, next is distribution. And lastly, that's where retail comes in, which is you and I. So let's start with generation. So, they have all these power plants, and what they need to do is to grab raw materials such as coal and gas to generate electricity, right? So, anyone tells you that, electricity is a clean energy, just say that they're lying or they don't know what they're talking about, because, things like coal and gas is required to power a power plant to generate electricity. About 40% of their energy is generated through coal, and then about 50% is through gas. My guess is they get the gas from Petronas gas. Now, most Malaysians think that Tenaga is the only person generating electricity in Malaysia. That's not true. There's actually, or the Malaysian government actually allows 6 other, what we call IPP, or independent power producers, alongside Tenaga to generate electricity. So next is the grid. Basically, this is the link between the power plants and the distribution network. So it's a very, very important thing. And that's why the Malaysian government worked really hard to build it extensively in the 80s. Okay, and then next is, of course, the distribution network. Of course, this is the network that allows you and I to use electricity consistently. So they have to work very hard to produce what we call an endless supply, right? A consistent and endless supply of electricity. So the last part, or the final piece of their business, is actually retail, which is basically the end users. And in terms of breakdown, as of 2019, industrials, so your factories and all that, use 38.6% of the energy generated. And then in second place, 34.8% are commercial. So you're talking about like businesses and office and all that. And then domestic, which is your house and all that, is 23.6%, and others at 3%. So that's really the retail breakdown for Tenaga. Okay, now how about the management, right? The main guy on top. And that person is Datuk Sri Amir Hamzah bin Azizan, who is the president/CEO and also the non-independent executive director. He has a degree in finance and economics from Syracuse University, which is situated in New York, the United States. So when he started work in 1990 all the way until 1999, he was at Shell, where he was very much involved in the finance, corporate finance, and treasury departments. After that, in 2000, he hopped on to MISC, which is a big shipping company in Malaysia. Started off as the general manager, and then in 2010, he left the company as the CEO. So after that, 2010 to 2016, he worked at Petronas, where he was very much involved in the downstream department, as well as a little bit about lubricants. Then he had a short stint as managing director at Icon Offshore Berhad from 2017 to 2019, and this is quite interesting. He was the CEO at Theme Attractions, Resorts and Hotels in Berhad. Very interesting. And then finally in 2019, he became the CEO of Tenaga. Okay, now how about the financials, right? So I'm just going to look at 5 years data. And in 2016, the revenue was 44 million. And in 2020, it was only at about 46 million. So a 2 million increase in a span of 5 years. So I think this is very clear that you're buying a company that has not grown its revenue by leaps and jumps. And we'll kind of, dissect why is that the case later on. Okay, for the third quarter of 2020, revenue fell 12.1% to 11 billion from 12.6 billion. Much of it has to do with because, there's less industrial use, right? During COVID, a lot of factories cannot open. So now, how about the profit before tax? 2016, that number was 8.9 billion, and 2020, it has fell to 4.1 billion. So about a 40% drop. For the third quarter, profit before tax actually dropped by 208 million, mostly because the finance cost has gone up. But this was also cushioned by some gain in forex translations, and also their non-cash gain as well. So how about my favorite number, right? The operating cash flow. So it has dropped about 4 billion from 14 billion to 10.7 billion when you compare quarter on quarter. Mostly because business is bad, right? There's no other way to describe it. Lastly, let's talk about the net debt when it comes to the financials, right? 2016, the net debt was at 27 billion, but it has nearly tripled after 5 years in 2020 at 64 billion. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the debt later on. Okay, now what's good about the company? What are some potentials? What's driving the company forward? The first is that Malaysia is a growing country. We are a young country. Our population is growing. So the electricity consumption per capita, even though it's at about 3 to 4%, it's still a lot better than other developed nations, right? We are growing basically. Not everybody has electricity in Malaysia, unfortunately. And even those that do, don't use it as much. So when we use more electrical appliances, when we use more air conditioners, when we have more high-rise buildings with air conditioners and all that, then obviously the nation is going to grow. So you've got that going for Tenaga. Now this next advantage is probably their biggest one, which is the monopoly. Only Tenaga can distribute energy or electricity to you and I, right? But they are not the only ones that can generate power. But everything after that, they basically have a monopoly, which basically means they have no competitors. They are the only game in town. Now, this next point or advantage is linked to the previous one, right? Which is that because they have a monopoly, so they are being regulated under this thing called the IBR, or the incentive-based regulation, which began in about 2015. Basically, it limits the downside of Tenaga. And what I mean by that is that no matter how coal or gas prices fluctuate, they're able to pass it on to consumers like you and I, unfortunately for us, of course. This means that no matter what, Tenaga will be kept afloat and they will be profitable. And how do they do it? Basically, there are two costs involved in this IBR. One is to manage fuel costs, or FCPT, or fuel cost pass-through. The next one is the generation-specific cost adjustment, or the GSCPT, which is related to fuel, but not the fuel itself. It's just the procurement, let's say, of the fuel. So these are some of the costs that the government allows Tenaga to pass on to consumers. The last good thing that I think is going for Tenaga is that they are investing into renewables quite aggressively, right? They have wind, solar, and mostly wind and solar, and hydro as well. Investments in places like the UK, India, and Turkey. And for Malaysia, even though their generation for renewables is only at 0.6%, it just shows you how much more growth that they can have. All right, now what do I think is some of the risks and what's bad when it comes to the stock, right? I think the first thing is to get rid out of your mind this thing called blue chip. Anyone who tells you to buy blue chip stocks or to say that it's very good, they don't know what they're talking about, quite frankly. Because the word blue chip implies that the risk is very low. But I think that even with something as stable, or a company as stable as Tenaga, it is still, and some people call it blue chip, it is still something that there is risk, right? So do not ever think that Tenaga or any other stock out there is blue chip just because other people say it, or because it's a commonly held belief. Okay, so the next thing about what's bad about the company, or rather some of the risks you really need to take a look at, is commodities fluctuation, especially with coal and gas. Now, I said earlier on that the company is allowed by the government to pass on costs to the consumers, but the reason the government is involved is also so that consumers like you and I don't have to pay super high electricity bills. So what this means is that although they can pass through some of the costs, they cannot pass through everything, which means that the cost of coal and gas, which is important for their power generation, will still affect the company negatively when it goes up. Now, related to that is the third point, right, which is politics really play a role in Tenaga. So a good example would be tariffs, right? Tariffs is basically the government telling Tenaga, hey, this is the amount of money you're able to charge consumers like you and I. Which means that the revenue and the potential or the upside for Tenaga is also capped, which is not something that's necessarily good for an investor, right? So right now we are in the regulatory period 2, which is basically RP2, which is just how the government gives the orders or the notice for what the tariffs are and a bunch of other things. And it was due to end actually in December 2020, but because of COVID, it actually got extended for a few more months or maybe even a year. So that's not It's quite a sad thing for investors, I would say. So you would think that because people now stay at home a lot more thanks to COVID and thanks to the MCO, that the electricity consumption will go up, right? Which means even though factories are not open, but now household will, kind of replace factories when it comes to generation, power or electricity being used. So you would think, hey, this is a okay thing for Tenaga, right? But here's the problem, right? In June, a lot of people started complaining about Tenaga bills or the electricity bills going up a lot higher. And so guess what? Tenaga was actually summoned by the government to explain why this is the case. So this is, I think, a very clear way of me showing you that politics is really, really a big factor. Then 5 months later, in November 2020, Tenaga actually had to, start giving out discounts, right? So there you go. The next disadvantage or potential risk that I see with the company is this. One of the big advantages, as I said earlier on, for Tenaga is that they are in Malaysia. So the government actually plays a role in helping them generate revenue. But when they go over into foreign countries, right, they don't have that same benefit anymore. So there's obviously a risk that some of the projects will not work out. Next, we have the debt. Now, so for utility companies, actually, it's very typical for them to take on a lot of debt, right? Because it has consistent cash flows. So it's very safe to take a lot of debt to pay off the interest. And that's why, if you go to America and you see they take a lot of debt. So it makes sense to take debt. Now, with regards to Tenaga, they also have a net debt position, which means they have more debt than they do cash. And so on the surface, it might not be a bad thing. But I think one area of risk you need to take note of is that they have tripled their debt in 5 years, nearly tripled. But the profits and revenues have stayed flat in the case of revenues, but the profit has actually halved or declined. So that's not something that you really want to see as an investor. Now, this doesn't mean that Tenaga is bad. Maybe they are investing in other projects that will generate higher returns in the future, and that's something you have to do a little bit more research on. But this is definitely a risk that you cannot ignore. So if you're a Tenaga shareholder, I hope you now know a little bit more about Tenaga as to whether or not you should hold on to it or to get rid of it or maybe even buy more of it. If you are not a shareholder, hopefully I've educated you a little bit more about the stock. And of course, do watch some of our other videos. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, Instagram, join our Telegram group chat, and see you in the next video.